It is a pleasure to be here, partnering the Hoya Sustainability Network. This is a responsibility for all of us just to defend what we think is valuable in the world. We at the Georgetown Club of Spain, we are the Georgetown University Association in Spain. We are around 150 members, full members right now. We've been awarded 3 out of the 4 years as the international best club at the Georgetown University, so we are very proud of it. We are very happy because we have the King of Spain as our president of honor, and it's always a privilege to count on him on our events, on some of them. So basically, the goal of our club, we are not a lucrative organization. We do not defend any political or any religious mantra. So we are quite free. And so our only goal is to enrich the day-to-day of our members and friends, organizing events of every kind. And sustainability is one of the topic that we try to boost more. Basically, I would probably highlight a couple of leadership series we have. We have one consisting of breakfast, where we invite top people in sectors where, as a country, Spain is competitive. So we brought Vicente del Bosque, like the national coach, winner of the World Cup, the president of PwC, the CEO of Endesa, Chicote, a famous chef, plenty of people, but in sectors where, as a country, we are competitive. We also have a social series where we visit one city in the country. So we went to Mallorca with Rafa Nadal. We went to Jerez, where, to try the wine and, so visiting, because Spain is very rich in terms of cities. And, we organize these weekends for our members, and we enjoy also socially speaking. This year, for example, we will celebrate the 25th anniversary of the club in November, and we will put together a weekend where we will have a dinner with the king on a Friday. Then on Saturday, we will celebrate conferences with the mayor of Madrid, and then a chef, and then a dinner with a show. And on the Sunday, we will, organize private visits. So it will take place in November 13th to November 15th. We will announce it, and probably the new president of the Georgetown University will be visiting us. So having said this, that's for the club. Today is a privilege to be here, and today we will have 4 top presenters: Shruthi, Baskaran-Makanju, Flavio Cabrera, Raquel Diaz, and Audrey Marmon-Halm, coming from very different backgrounds, Sub-Saharan Africa, Mexico, Barcelona, Ghana, and they will be presenting different topics such as community engagement, community-based solutions, consumer behavior for waste prevention, innovation in resource-constrained environments, or operational efficiency in the food value chain. And each presenter will be providing a presentation of 15 minutes. And then all of you will have the opportunity just to make questions through the chat, so that at the end of the session, after the 4 presentations, we will be discussing these questions. And so I will start introducing the first speaker. That is going to be Shruthi. Shruthi is a member of the social impact practice at Boston Consulting Group. She is an expert in food systems, agriculture, and nutrition, with extensive experience leading agricultural development work across Sub-Saharan Africa. Shruthi is passionate about food systems, innovation in resource-constrained environments, and the impact of consumer behavior on development in both developed and emerging markets. And she has worked on several aspects of the ecosystem to design holistic, sustainable solutions to create long-term change. Previously, Shruthi worked with the UN World Food Programme as the mission lead for the Passion Procurement Platform, and as special assistant to the Director of Innovation and Change Management. So Shruthi, please, I leave you the floor to continue.
Thank you so much, Ruben. Let me just share my screen. So just to kind of set the stage here, I think food loss and waste sits at the intersection of climate, of equity, and economic development. And so it is really one of the most highest leverage problems that we can all tackle as a community today. And I'll kind of try to provide a little bit of a global overview, as well as a range of solutions that are happening with a particular emphasis on the emerging markets, especially India and sub-Saharan Africa. A quick note on terminology before I move through the rest of my presentation. I will kind of use food loss and waste interchangeably, but they do have specific definitions in this sphere. Food loss is what happens upstream. So this is on farms, in households, etc. Food waste is what happens once consumers kind of come into the picture. So you're talking about retail, restaurants, etc. And the distinction kind of matters a little bit because the solutions that you will apply are quite different based on which part of the value chain you are talking about. Carlene already kind of went through some of this, so I won't belabor the point, but really 1/3 of all the food that is produced in the world is either lost or wasted, which is crazy if you kind of think about just the sheer magnitude of those numbers, right? So more than 1 billion meals are wasted every single day. The economic toll is $1.2 trillion. And that's a lot of zeros in there. If you really think about, framing that as the GDP of some of the countries, like you would be looking at several African countries combined in terms of the economic losses that we face from food loss and waste. And that is 1.4 billion hectares of land that is used to produce, if you translate the amount of food that is wasted into actual land opportunity. And as a result, you end up with 780 million people that are malnourished. Sub-Saharan Africa specifically loses about 37% of all of the food that is produced, disproportionately affecting smallholder farmers, who are about 80% of the producers in the continent. And India, on the other hand, loses about $13 to $14 billion of food waste every year, which is really the entire export value of all the food in India combined. So we're exporting $14 billion of food, but we're also losing $14 billion of food. So, I mean, these are big numbers, and sometimes it's very easy that it's like going right through your head, but like just think about the magnitude of those numbers. And the supply chain is very long. Agricultural supply chains especially are very complex, because you kind of have to like keep the integrity of the product from when it is produced all the way through the household. And you'll be, I'm not going to talk a lot about all of the different stages of the supply chain, but what I would like to draw your attention to is actually at the bottom of the page, which is that food loss and waste happens across the supply chain, but it actually looks very different when you're talking about the US context or even any other developed world context versus if you're talking about an emerging market or a developing world context. In the US, you see that upstream, so this is the production part of the value chain, is only 1/3 of the food waste. As Carlene was mentioning in her initial, introduction to the presentation, downstream at home is where 2/3 of the food loss and waste happens. This is exactly the opposite when you talk about Africa. 2/3 of the waste actually happens on farm in the upstream part of the value chain, compared to downstream is only 1/3 of the waste. And so the kind of key upstream drivers are, a lot of it comes down to inadequate storage. I could tell you a story about how in 2012, Nigeria had what they call the cassava glut of Nigeria, where, there was a presidential proclamation, all of the farmers produced so much cassava, but cassava in its, kind of true form develops cyanide within 48 hours if you don't store it right. And there's just no proper storage facilities. And as a result, like you would drive through the streets of Lagos and you would just see, or not Lagos, but you would drive through the streets and you would just see scores of cassava on the sidelines. And it literally became a cassava glut because yes, you produced so much, but then what happened of it? No one benefited from it, not for industrial applications, not for food. Most of it was wasted. And that is a pretty common story that you kind of see across many sub-Saharan African countries. India has a little bit of a mixed picture. I would say upstream dominates. In India has several states, and each state is essentially a country of its own in terms of population, in terms of culture, in terms of food, what they eat, like everything is so different. Infrastructure is no different. In the states where upstream infrastructure is not as strong, upstream dominates. And then in the states where upstream infrastructure is strong, downstream dominates. So you really do get a mixed bag across India. And so, I talked a little bit about this. It's not just about storage. I think a lot of it actually comes down to the fact that if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, especially, the production base is extraordinarily fragmented. So you have about, 70 to 90% are smallholder farmers. They're producing the majority of the food. And this is not just crops, it's also livestock is like majority produced by smallholder farmers. So what that means is that each farm holding is like a hectare or an acre of land, compared to, if you look at the average size of like a small farm in the US would be something like 1,500 acres, right? And so by definition, you just get economies of scale in larger farms that you just don't get in smallholder farms. So there's like that aggregation potential is lost. There's a lot of missing middle in the sense that, and this actually connects to a lot of the broader infrastructure problems. So when we talk about cold chain penetration, electricity shortages, there's not as many pack houses, there's not digital solutions available. This is rapidly changing, but you're still starting from a very low baseline. And then finally, you've probably heard of this in the context of emerging markets and agricultural production, but the market linkages are extraordinarily weak. So you're traversing long distances, and food, whether it's crops or livestock, is passing hands so many times before it gets to the final consumer that you just kind of lose a lot of signals along the way. And informal markets are dominating. Most people are not going to the supermarket to buy things. They're going to their local greengrocer, or they're going to their local butcher. And that brings with it its own host of challenges. And that is the system. And then when you overlay the fact that there's so much climate and biological stress applied on top, Africa is at the like kind of receiving end of most of the impacts of climate change, if you will. Like there's a lot of volatility in rainfall. There's droughts all over the place. I have worked in Africa for the last 10 years. I've worked in 26 countries in Africa, and the 2023 drought in Ethiopia took out 95% of all the livestock there. The same year, Kenya had $1.2 billion of losses in livestock from a drought because farmers could simply not afford to feed their animals, and they just perished. And the crop story is not that different. So what does that mean, like in terms of implications, is that most of the loss happens upstream. Farmers, as a result, are selling whatever they are managing to scramble in a very distressed way, which means they're not capturing as much of the final value, which means they can't reinvest in storage solutions. And it is especially pernicious because it coexists with malnutrition. People are starving, but there's no food. It's not that there's no food, it's just it's being produced and then it's being lost as well. Women are disproportionately also affected in a lot of this. And then on top of that, if you think about the environmental impacts of it, you're tilling the land, you're growing the same thing over and over, and then food decomposes, which again adds to greenhouse gas emissions. But I will point out that Africa is not in the mitigation story, right? Like it is such a small contributor in the grander scheme of like what actually contributes greenhouse gas emissions, which is why it is the last thing on the page, but it is true nonetheless. So what do we do about this, right? And you really have to think about every systems problem has a system solution, and sometimes it's more complex than it needs to be. And I think this is an easy representation to kind of wrap our head around the fact that there's no one single silver bullet solution. You really have to think about food loss and waste as a multifaceted approach, and there's a multi-step hierarchy here. People often jump to reduce, reuse, recycle, which is great, right? But in the context of food, actually, preventing food loss is the best thing that you can do. Because as I was saying, especially in the context of the emerging markets, most of the food loss is actually happening upstream, which means preventing it. So every ton of food that is not lost means more people, are getting fed. People are not going to bed hungry. And so I think in India, for instance, like preventing even 10% of what is lost of post-harvest losses would feed more people than all of the bilateral programs put together. And that is just the reality of it. Redistribution is a really powerful mechanism, but then it requires a lot of different conditions, right? You need storage, you need proper networks, you need frameworks. In Nigeria and South Africa, you do kind of see that like food from urban markets often can't reach food insecure populations elsewhere because the road conditions are just not there. There's not enough cold storage supply infrastructure. Reusing, recycling, recovering, I think those are where the circular economy kind of intersects with, your rural development. So like crop bright products, for instance, like if you grow crops and like rice, for instance, you use the paddy, but then there's a bunch of chaff that's left behind. What do you do with it? Can you use it for animal feed? Can you kind of use it as biodegradable energy sources, etc.? So that's where you start getting into the circular economy of things. Recycling and recovering, I think you guys are probably the most familiar with in terms of like what you actually see day to day in a lot of like the developed world context. So, but I think the goal is to send as little waste to the landfill or incinerate as possible. And there's innovation happening across the world. I'm not going to talk about all of these examples. I will go into one example in terms of how we can leverage AI, because everybody's talking about AI. AI comes with its own host of challenges in some ways, because I'm sure you've all heard of the amount of water that is using up, etc. We're not going to discuss that. Again, systems are complicated. There's no one single, silver bullet vector that's going to be the panacea for all problems that we face. And so approaching everything with moderation is really important. But innovation is happening. And I think most interestingly, perhaps, is that some of the coolest innovation is actually happening in places where the necessity is the highest. And that happens to be in places like India and Sub-Saharan Africa. And I will give some examples across the board. And I will go into detail on one example. I think AI and digital tools are really interesting. And I want to make a specific point on it, because 5 years ago, how many of us were using AI the way that we are today? Definitely not me, right? Maybe my husband, he works in tech, and he's always playing around with the coolest thing before it becomes cool. But not really. And I think today it is such a different story, and the pace of progression is so exponential that we don't really know how it can be in the next 3 to 5 years. And I think that is kind of the most unique and interesting opportunity that comes out of this, because mobile computing is just transformed today. And the amount of data that we now have available, especially if you put your mind to it, you can predict and you can project and you can forecast almost anything that happens. And I will give you an example of how BCG, my organization, actually worked with the government of Egypt, as well as FCDO, which is the UK's Department of Aid, in order to develop a solution to prevent post-harvest losses in maize in Egypt. And then there's a bunch of other, kind of examples that are pointed out here, not all of which are relevant to an emerging world context. But again, there's AI-powered demand forecasting, there's surplus platforms. We can think about reorganizing some of the byproducts, et cetera. And then I will end on kind of some specific innovation notes for Africa. So in Egypt, and this is not, it's not an uncommon story that you hear all the time. Egypt is really kind of the bridge between the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa, making it a pretty useful proof of concept, I would say, because this, the fact that it can work in Egypt means that it can work in a whole host of other countries. Maize accounts for a significant percentage of Egypt's food basket, or the calorific intake of people. Maize is just corn for those of us in the West. And 15 to 30% post-harvest loss is a huge amount if you really take a step back and think about it. It is systemic and it has real hunger consequences. And so the solution was a geospatial AI platform that we built in partnership with the UK's FCDO as well as the Egyptian government. So it maps bottlenecks across the supply chain, so cold storage gaps, any places where there's inefficient transportation routes, for instance. It modeled investment scenarios, and then it helped prevent policymakers. It was really helping policymakers prioritize capital allocation in the system in a way that would actually help resolve some of the food loss issues. And the expected outcome is a 20% increase in farmer income, which is, tremendous if you kind of think about the scale of the smallholders that are involved in maize production. And I think a 4% reduction in water use, and it created 11,000 new jobs. And I think overall, the 20% cut in maize loss alone is 4.5 million tons of maize. That's $1 billion. And that's 9 billion extra meals. And then if you can actually extrapolate this into a broader context and think about where you can take this kind of solution and apply it, there's a huge amount of potential. And all of that relies on the fact that we are able to capture the power of data, and we're able to work upstream and really think about, who is the decision maker in this particular case. It is the government. And you're able to funnel funds and capital in a much more productive and organized and optimized way. And that is kind of, and if I were to think about the scalability, obviously the exact same system can scale to a lot of places in Sub-Saharan Africa that also have maize as the primary crop. But then, kind of flipping to the other side, and if you think about India, India has similar dynamics, especially in the northern part of India. And the government is already investing significantly in digital infrastructure over the last 10 years. There's a PM Kisan, which is an AI-based advisory that farmers can access on their mobile phones. There's a marketplace that they've set up across all of the different states that is completely digitized. So you get warehouse receipts, etc. So you bring your wares, sell it, you get a receipt. It's like all standardized, so there's like limited kind of potential for more food loss and waste in that. The key innovation is not the AI. The key innovation is that AI is being used to support decision making. And in similar ways, you'll see it is being used to support capital allocation. And so AI is not the end, it's the means to an end. And so it's really about how we're using it in order to further the objectives that we have set forth for ourselves. So key takeaways, emerging markets don't need to replicate the same paths that developed markets have taken. Because the fact that they are facing these challenges today in a world where so many new innovative solutions exist, they're just in a different place where we're facing these problems than when the developed world faced these problems 40, 50, 60 years ago. And so there's a real opportunity here to leapfrog across multiple rounds of innovation and jump directly to solutions that might not have some of the unforeseen or unintended consequences as we might have faced in prior rounds of this. And so whether you can skip some of the centralized infrastructure build outs and things that require a lot of capital, things that put a lot more carbon into the air, and jump into micro warehousing or pack houses with grading and sorting at source and so on. I'm not going to go into every single one of this. I'm happy to connect with all of you and talk further if any of this is of interest. But I think really there's kind of three big opportunities that we see: decentralized infrastructure, digital and data, really powered by AI, and also local processing and circularity. So really thinking about how do you make sure that almost every component of what you're producing is used in some form or fashion. And the benefit of that, especially, is that it also creates new revenue streams from waste and reduces your dependence on cold chain.
I would like to open the space if the audience has questions. If you have a couple of questions, we will be happy to probably respond them now before going through the next presenter.
Shruti, I have a question. I know that cassava is used and transformed at the household or small scale level in Nigeria, whether it's fufu or flour and all kind of stuff. So is the solution include those cultural or traditional transformation closer to the farm? So even if you don't have cold storage, etc., but you can still preserve the flour, for instance, on its way to the market, to a larger market. The other question that I have, sorry, Ruben, is for the transformation in terms of governance, are solutions around cooperative where, because sometimes a transformation might require more capital. Are we thinking along the line of having groups of farmers or to transform those products around the cooperative, for instance? I know that, for instance, I'm from Haiti. They do that for coffee or cacao in Haiti. So I was thinking about if there are similar governance, if you will, system being considered.
Yeah, no, Nigeria is a really interesting example. Absolutely. I think so. The big distinction I'll make there is that smallholder production, especially at that level, is for self-consumption. And that waste is actually relatively minimal. The waste happens much more when smaller farmers are trying to sell the surplus, which means that already kind of, they're not in the subsistence category. You're talking about pre-commercial farmers that are producing more than what they actually need to feed their own families, are trying to get it into the market. And what ends up happening there is that some of the preservation mechanisms are just not as scale downable, if you will, compared to if you actually have the aggregate power across a series of farms, which leads me directly into your second question. But before that, Nigeria also, a majority of the cassava that Nigeria produces is actually industrial cassava. It is the largest cassava producer in the world, but China is well above, and a huge part of that is because there's just not as much processing infrastructure in Nigeria. But anyway, that is a whole different conversation for another time. We're actually working closely with the Vice President's office in Nigeria to set up a cassava accelerator there. So stay tuned to see whether that changes in the next 6 years. On the governance models, I think high value crops like chocolate, tomatoes, cacao, take a very different path compared to a lot of the staple grains. Cooperatives work really well when the price incentive is very strong, in my opinion. What happens in the smaller scale kind of grain type of production is that the margins are so small. So ultimately, even if you get a bunch of farmers together as a cooperative, the amount of additional investment that they will have to make in order to have all of this, the economics of it make sense, is very limited. What we have seen work instead are more outgrower schemes. So what happens is that there's, a larger company, like Olam did this with rice in Nigeria. You have a larger company that takes on a lot of the financial liability, for instance, by procuring harvesting machines that they hold as their property. It's their asset, and the farmers who are outgrowers on a specific plot of land or whatever, they're farming on their own land, but then they're able to strike up kind of a fair price agreement where they say, hey, like in exchange for us not side selling, we will sell it to you for a specific price guarantee. In exchange for that, you support us by providing us some of these inputs at cost. And so it takes out the initial capital allocation outlay out. And so, as an example, like, let's say a big producer has these inputs, or, they're talking about like, any kind of like treatments for the plants, etc. They offer it to the farmers at cost. Farmer produces, has a better yield because they just have a better, a crop cycle. And then when they come back to sell it to the big producer says, hey, these are the inputs you've used. I'm going to subtract this amount of money, and here's the rest of your cash. So it ends up setting a much more virtuous cycle in some ways, because you get the aggregation benefit of being with a big producer, but you also retain agency ownership over smaller tracts of land, and you are providing more of that dignity to the smallholder farmer to kind of, treat it as they would see fit by being part of a larger program.
Sense. Thank you.
Of course.